On a warm summer evening in June 2021, the entire global football community pulled up a chair to witness what was supposed to be a joyous celebration of continental sport. The opening weekend of the European Championship was underway, and Denmark was facing Finland in front of a passionate, roaring home crowd at the Parken Stadium in Copenhagen. The atmosphere inside the arena was absolutely electric, filled with singing, waving flags, and the intense competitive energy that only a major international tournament can bring. For 42 minutes, the match followed the familiar, beautiful script of elite modern football, with players sprinting across the grass, executing tactical systems, and battling for dominance in every single square meter of the pitch. But then, in one horrific, unscripted moment, the beautiful game evaporated into thin air, and the entire world was plunged into a state of absolute, breathless terror. Christian Eriksen, the undisputed talisman, creative heartbeat, and beloved superstar of the Danish national team, walked casually toward the left touchline to receive a routine throw-in from his teammate. As the ball bounced toward him, there was no collision, no sudden challenge from a defender, and no physical contact whatsoever. Instead, Eriksen staggered forward for two heavy, unnatural steps, his knees buckled beneath his weight, and he fell face-first directly into the turf. In those first 3 seconds, the television commentators and the fans in the stadium assumed he had merely tripped or suffered a sudden muscular pull. But as his body remained completely motionless, face buried in the grass, a dark, terrifying realization swept across the pitch like an icy wind. The Finnish defender nearest to him frantically gestured toward the medical staff, his face contorted in sheer panic, waving his arms with a level of desperation that signaled an immediate life-or-death crisis. Within moments, Danish captain Simon Kjær sprinted across the field, displaying an incredible level of psychological bravery as he reached Eriksen first, ensuring his teammate had not swallowed his tongue, and clearing his airway before the doctors even arrived. When the medical team reached the spot, the casual broadcast of a football match transformed into a live, terrifying window into a human tragedy. The cameras focused on the frantic movements of the paramedics as they opened their emergency kits, and the entire world watched in absolute horror as a doctor began performing chest compressions on Eriksen's limp body. The stadium, which just moments prior had been a cauldron of deafening noise, fell into a heavy, suffocating silence that felt entirely unnatural. Before we dissect how this terrifying moment reshaped the collective consciousness of modern football safety, do me a very quick favor. If you believe that moments like these show that football is far more than just a game, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button to support the channel, and leave a comment below sharing exactly where you were and what you felt when you saw the world stop for Christian Eriksen on that fateful afternoon. We read every single comment, so join the community below. Now, as the chest compressions continued on the pitch, the psychological terror among the players reached a breaking point. Tears began streaming down the faces of hardened professional athletes who had played in the most hostile stadiums in the world. They were completely helpless, forced to confront the sudden, brutal reality that their brother, a man at the absolute peak of human physical fitness, was dying right in front of their eyes. Simon Kjær and goalkeeper Kasper Schmeichel displayed legendary leadership, organizing the Danish players into a tight, circular human shield around Eriksen's body. They did this to protect their friend's dignity from the prying eyes of the stadium cameras and the millions of people watching around the globe, standing with their backs to the medical staff, weeping and praying as the defibrillator paddles were deployed. The television broadcast cut away to the crowd, showing fans from both Denmark and Finland weeping openly, holding their heads in their hands, united in a collective nightmare that completely transcended sporting rivalry. For 13 agonizing minutes, Christian Eriksen was clinically dead on the pitch, his heart completely stopped by a sudden cardiac arrest. The sheer terror of that afternoon did not just stem from the physical event itself, but from the shattering of the illusion that elite footballers are immortal gladiators who are immune to the frailties of the human condition. It proved that underneath the multi-million-dollar contracts, the worldwide fame, and the hyper-optimized athletic conditioning, these men are fragile human beings whose lives can hang by a microscopic thread in the middle of a game. When Eriksen was finally wheeled off the pitch on a stretcher, surrounded by white sheets and awake with his hand on his forehead, a collective gasp of relief echoed across the planet. That horrifying afternoon changed the sport forever, leaving an indelible scar on everyone who witnessed it, and serving as a chilling reminder that the line between a sporting spectacle and an absolute tragedy is incredibly thin. It was a day when the clock stopped, the ball stood still, and the entire world realized that a human life will always be infinitely more important than the beautiful game. The psychological shockwaves that rippled across Copenhagen in 2021 were intensely familiar to anyone who remembered the cold, damp evening of March 17, 2012. On that night, a standard FA Cup quarter-final clash between Tottenham Hotspur and Bolton Wanderers at White Hart Lane became the stage for one of the most terrifying and medically miraculous events in the history of English football. The stadium was packed to the rafters with thousands of passionate fans chanting under the floodlights, expecting a fierce tactical battle for a spot at Wembley. The game had reached the 41st minute with the score tied at 1-1, a high-intensity affair with players sprinting across the pitch and fighting for every loose ball. Then, far away from the active play, and completely unprovoked by any physical tackle, Bolton's 23-year-old midfielder Fabrice Muamba suddenly collapsed near the center circle. Unlike a typical football injury, where a player rolls in pain or clutches a joint, Muamba fell heavily, face first into the grass, his limbs completely stiffening as his body hit the turf. The referee on that night, Howard Webb, was a veteran of World Cup finals and hardened by decades of officiating, but as he ran toward the fallen midfielder, he realized instantly that this was no ordinary sporting injury. Webb later recounted that the moment he looked down at Muamba's face, he saw a completely blank, lifeless expression that sent a chill straight down his spine. He frantically waved his arms to summon the medical teams, bypassing the standard protocol of inspecting the player first, because every single second was a precious commodity in the race against death. Within moments, medical staff from both clubs, accompanied by emergency paramedics, scrambled onto grass, their faces pale with a shared sense of overwhelming dread. The atmosphere inside White Hart Lane changed instantly from a raucous football cauldron into a chamber of absolute, suffocating terror. The fans in the stands stopped singing, the flags were lowered, and an eerie, unnatural silence descended upon the stadium as a defibrillator was rushed onto the pitch. The players from both Bolton and Tottenham congregated around the medical team, their hands pressed against their heads in utter disbelief, some falling to their knees to pray, while tears streamed openly down their faces. They were looking at a young athlete who was the embodiment of physical power, fitness, and vitality, suddenly reduced to a lifeless form on the grass. What the public did not know in those agonizing moments on the pitch was the true extent of the horror taking place beneath the feet of the medical staff. Fabrice Muamba's heart had completely stopped beating due to a sudden hypertrophic cardiomyopathy event. He was not merely unconscious, he was clinically dead. The paramedics administered multiple electrical shocks using the automated external defibrillator right there on the grass, but the machine repeatedly failed to register a pulse. Realizing that the stadium pitch was turning into a public morgue, the medical team made the desperate decision to lift Muamba onto a stretcher and rush him toward an ambulance, all while a doctor continuously performed manual chest compressions on his body as the stretcher moved across the touchline. The referee, in full consultation with both managers, officially abandoned the match, a decision that the thousands of fans in the stadium supported with a somber, respectful round of applause as they slowly exited the arena in total shock. The true scale of the medical miracle began to unfold during the frantic journey to the London Chest Hospital and inside the resuscitation room. For a staggering 78 minutes, Fabrice Muamba's heart did not beat a single time on its own. He received 15 separate defibrillator shocks in total, 12 of them inside the ambulance, and 3 more after arriving at the hospital, as a team of elite consultants fought aggressively to bring him back from the edge of eternity. By all accounts of classical sports medicine, a human body deprived of a natural heartbeat for over an hour should have suffered catastrophic, irreversible brain damage or total organ failure. Yet, after 78 minutes of continuous cardiopulmonary resuscitation and relentless medical intervention, Muamba's heart suddenly triggered a weak, independent rhythm. The news of his survival and subsequent full recovery stunned the global medical community and left the football world in a state of absolute awe. It was a terrifying event that proved just how dangerously thin the line is between an elite sporting performance and sudden biological collapse, forever changing the mandatory cardiac screening protocols for young athletes across the globe. While sudden biological collapses represent a silent, internal terror on the pitch, there's another category of fear that stems from the raw, violent kinetic friction of elite football. On October 14, 2006, the Medeski Stadium played host to a Premier League fixture between Reading and Chelsea that would instantly become etched in football history for all the wrong reasons. The match was barely 20 seconds old when a long, speculative ball was played deep into the Chelsea penalty area. Chelsea's 24-year-old goalkeeper, Petr Cech, slid bravely along the grass to collect the loose ball, securing it safely within his arms near the edge of the 6-yard box. However, Reading midfielder Stephen Hunt did not pull out his running stride, and his trailing knee collided with tremendous, sickening force directly into the right side of Cech's head. The impact was deafening for those close to the action, a brutal metal-on-bone sound that signaled immediate catastrophe. Cech immediately dropped the ball, his body convulsing slightly before rolling off the pitch onto the touchline, where he began to crawl on his hands and knees in a state of complete, terrified disorientation. On the touchline, Chelsea manager Jose Mourinho was screaming at the referee, realizing instantly from Cech's unnatural movements that his goalkeeper had suffered a catastrophic neurological injury. The referee frantically signaled for the medical staff, who rushed to the touchline to attend to the fallen star. What happened in the subsequent minutes inside the stadium and the dressing room was a masterclass in institutional panic and hidden terror. Cech was eventually assisted off the pitch, unable to stand on his own, his eyes rolling back as his consciousness began to rapidly slip away. In the dressing room, away from the eyes of the crowd, the situation turned into a literal nightmare. Cech's physical condition deteriorated at an alarming rate. He began vomiting uncontrollably, lost the ability to speak coherently, and fell into a deep state of unconsciousness. Mourinho later launched a furious, public attack on the local ambulance services, revealing that Cech had been left waiting in the stadium corridors for nearly 30 minutes while his brain was actively bleeding. The goalkeeper was rushed under emergency blue lights to the Royal Berkshire Hospital, but the initial scans revealed a reality so terrifying that he was immediately transferred to the specialized neurological unit at the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford. The impact of Hunt's knee had completely shattered Cech's skull, forcing multiple sharp bone fragments directly into his brain tissue. Doctors informed his family and the club that he was within minutes of losing his life due to intracranial pressure and internal bleeding. The surgeons had to operate immediately, performing a highly complex emergency craniotomy to lift the depressed bone fragments away from the brain, inserting 2 permanent metal plates and multiple surgical screws directly into his skull to rebuild his head structure. The football world watched in absolute shock as one of the best goalkeepers on the planet lay in an intensive care unit, fighting simply to regain his cognitive functions and basic speech. The sheer terror of that day did not just shake Chelsea, but sent a wave of profound fear through every professional goalkeeper across Europe. It proved that a routine, split-second decision to slide out and collect a ball could result in a life-altering, near-fatal brain injury. Cech survived the ordeal through the absolute brilliance of British neurosurgeons, making a miraculous return to the pitch just 3 months later, wearing the iconic, custom-built protective headguard that he would wear for the rest of his career. But the memory of that October afternoon remains a chilling reminder of the raw, physical brutality that lurks behind the glamour of modern football, a moment where a simple game almost cost a young man his life and his future. While physical injuries represent a terrifying medical reality on the pitch, there are moments in football history where the sport completely disintegrates into a state of raw, unadulterated human warfare. On June 2, 1962, the Estadio Nacional in Santiago became the arena for a World Cup group stage match between Chile and Italy that is universally remembered as the most violent, scary, and anarchic game ever played in the history of the tournament. The tension surrounding the fixture had reached a boiling point weeks before the first whistle was blown. 2 Italian journalists had written highly critical articles about the city of Santiago, describing it as a poverty-stricken backwater, which deeply insulted the pride of the Chilean population. By the time the Italian players stepped onto the pitch, the atmosphere inside the stadium was not one of sporting competition, but of absolute geopolitical hatred. The home crowd roared with a deafening, hostile fury, and from the very first minute, the football completely disappeared, replaced by a terrifying display of physical violence and psychological intimidation. The referee assigned to control this powder keg was Ken Aston, an English official who would later invent yellow and red cards, but on this day, he found himself utterly powerless as 22 men lost their minds. The first actual foul occurred after just 12 seconds of play, a brutal body check that set the tone for the rest of the afternoon. After only 8 minutes, Italian midfielder Giorgio Farini committed a violent tackle on a Chilean player and was promptly sent off by Aston. However, Farini completely refused to leave the pitch, causing a massive standoff that lasted for over 10 minutes. The stadium erupted into chaos as Chilean fans began hurling objects at the Italian bench, and the situation became so unstable that the Chilean civil police had to storm onto the grass with weapons drawn to physically arrest Farini and drag him down the tunnel. This intervention did not calm the players, it only increased the sense of absolute lawlessness. Players were openly punching each other in the face, while the referee's back was turned. The most iconic and terrifying moment of violence occurred later in the first half, when Chilean player Lionel Sanchez hit Italian defender Mario David with a devastating left hook that fractured his jaw. Amazingly, the referee did not see the punch, and no card was issued. Seeking absolute revenge, David waited just a few minutes before executing a flying, kung fu-style kick directly into Sanchez's shoulder and neck area, resulting in an immediate sending off and sparking a massive, multiplayer brawl in the center circle. The police had to invade the pitch for a second, third, and fourth time throughout the 90 minutes, forming human walls with riot shields to prevent a full-scale riot between the players and the technical staffs. The Italian team was subjected to a continuous barrage of spit, kicks, and verbal abuse every time they went near the touchlines. The sheer terror of the Battle of Santiago lay in the absolute breakdown of institutional authority. The players on the pitch realized that the referee had completely lost control of the match, meaning there were no rules, no safety, and no protection from physical assault. It was a terrifying psychological experiment where elite athletes reverted to tribal violence in front of 66,000 screaming spectators. When the final whistle blew, sealing a 2-0 victory for Chile, the Italian team had to be escorted off the pitch by armed military police to ensure they could reach their dressing room alive. The match was described by British commentators as the most stupid, appalling, and disgusting exhibition of football in the history of the game, a chilling historical artifact that showed how easily the beautiful game can transform into a dark, terrifying theater of violence when hatred takes over the pitch. The transition from structural sports violence to the complete, unpredictable terror of crowd chaos is best exemplified by the dark events that unfolded during the UEFA Champions League quarterfinal on April 12, 2005. The iconic San Siro Stadium was the stage for a highly anticipated Euro derby between the two absolute giants of Italian football, AC Milan and Inter Milan. The European atmosphere inside the arena was heavily charged with decades of fierce local rivalry, with nearly 80,000 fans packing the stands to create a deafening wall of sound under the evening floodlights. AC Milan had won the first leg 2-0 and was leading the second leg 1-0 thanks to a brilliant goal by Andriy Shevchenko. This left Inter Milan facing a seemingly impossible aggregate deficit, causing the physical and emotional tension inside the stadium to reach a dangerous, unstable boiling point. The match reached the 71st minute of play when Inter Milan midfielder Esteban Cambiasso scored what appeared to be a perfectly valid goal from a corner kick. However, the German referee Markus Merck immediately disallowed the goal for an alleged foul on the AC Milan goalkeeper Dida. This controversial decision acted as the absolute catalyst for an explosion of fan fury that would transform one of Europe's most legendary football stadiums into a terrifying, apocalyptic war zone. Within a matter of seconds, the Cava Nord, the section of the stadium occupied by the most radical and violent ultra groups of Inter Milan, unleashed a relentless, highly organized barrage of dangerous projectiles directly onto the pitch. Hundreds of heavy plastic bottles, metal coins, flares, and industrial-grade smoke bombs rained down from the upper tiers into the AC Milan penalty area. The air became thick with toxic, acrid black smoke, completely obliterating the visibility on the pitch and forcing the players from both teams to retreat toward the center circle in absolute shock. The Brazilian goalkeeper Dida bravely remained near his goal line to assist the stadium stewards who were desperately trying to clear the burning debris from the grass. Then, in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror captured live on global television, a burning red marine flare traveled at high velocity through the smoky air and struck Dida directly on his right shoulder. The flare exploded upon impact, showering his neck and back in a cascade of white-hot sparks and intense heat. Dida instantly dropped to the turf in agony, his jersey smoldering as his teammates and medical staff sprinted into the blinding smoke to pull him away from the continuous rain of fire. The physical terror of seeing an elite athlete targeted and actively burned by a weapon launched from the stands sent shockwaves through the entire football world. Referee Marcus Merck immediately ordered both teams to abandon the pitch and retreat to the safety of the underground dressing rooms, suspending the match for nearly 25 minutes, while hundreds of riot police entered the stadium track with plastic shields to contain the escalating violence. An attempt was made to restart the game after the pitch was cleared, but the moment the players stepped back onto the grass, the Ultras began launching a second, even larger wave of flares and fireworks, some of which exploded dangerously close to the remaining players. The referee had no choice but to permanently abandon the match, a decision that cemented this night as one of the scariest and most shameful chapters in modern Champions League history. The iconic image of AC Milan's Rui Costa and Inter Milan's Marco Materazzi standing shoulder to shoulder, casually leaning on each other, while silently watching the stadium burn in front of them, became the definitive symbol of that chaotic night. It was a terrifying reminder of what happens when the intense passion of football gives way to pure, unregulated tribal madness, turning a beautiful sporting spectacle into a dangerous arena of fire where the physical safety of the players is completely sacrificed to the whims of an angry mob. The ultimate intersection between the beautiful game and the terrifying reality of geopolitical violence occurred on the chilly evening of November 13, 2015. The Stade de France, located just north of Paris, was the prestigious venue for a high-profile international friendly match between the reigning World Cup champions, Germany, and the host nation, France. Nearly 80,000 spectators, including the French President François Hollande, filled the magnificent arena, creating an atmosphere of immense national pride and sporting celebration. The match was a highly tactical, fast-paced encounter, with players focused entirely on their positioning and performance on the pitch. However, at the 16th minute of the game, a massive, deep explosion echoed through the concrete structure of the stadium. The sound was so loud that it was clearly captured by the live television microphones broadcasting the game to millions around the world. On the pitch, the players paused for a brief microsecond, momentarily confused, but the referee allowed the game to continue, assuming it was merely a powerful firecracker launched by a rogue fan in the stands. 3 minutes later, a second, even more violent explosion shook the stadium foundations, followed by a third detonation near a local commercial street just outside the arena walls. What the players, coaching staffs, and the thousands of fans inside the stadium did not know was that they were currently sitting at the epicenter of a highly coordinated, multi-pronged terrorist attack that was actively terrorizing the city of Paris. 3 suicide bombers had attempted to gain entry into the Stade de France with explosive vests, but after being turned away by stadium security at the turnstiles, they detonated their devices just outside the gates, killing innocent bystanders. Before we examine the terrifying atmosphere that engulfed the stadium during the subsequent hours, please do me a massive favor. If you believe that the resilience of football during these dark historical moments proves the undeniable strength of the sport, click that subscribe button right now, hit the like button, and leave a comment below sharing how you think clubs and stadiums should handle security in the modern era. We highly value your thoughts, so join the discussion down below. Now, back inside the stadium, the psychological terror began to spread silently through the infrastructure. While the match was allowed to finish its full 90 minutes to prevent a massive, catastrophic stampede among the 80,000 fans, the French president was secretly evacuated by elite security forces. Rumors and breaking news reports began filtering into the smartphones of the spectators in the stands, revealing the horrific details of the ongoing massacres taking place at the Bataclan Theater and local restaurants across Paris. A cloud of heavy, suffocating panic descended upon the crowd. When the final whistle blew, sealing a 2-0 victory for France, the stadium announcers instructed the fans not to exit through certain gates due to the active danger outside. In a state of absolute terror, thousands of panicked spectators rushed directly onto the pitch, seeking safety in the wide, open green space of the grass, weeping, embracing each other, and singing the national anthem in a defiant, fearful display of unity. Behind the scenes, the situation inside the changing rooms was a mixture of deep shock and intense survival instinct. The German national team was informed that they were a specific target, and for security reasons, they could not leave the stadium in their official team bus. The French players, displaying incredible solidarity and human empathy, completely refused to abandon their German rivals, choosing to spend the entire night hiding alongside them on the concrete floor of the stadium locker rooms. They remained trapped inside the arena until the early hours of the morning, monitoring the news in absolute silence as the sirens of hundreds of police cars echoed outside the walls. The sheer terror of that night permanently shattered the safe sanctuary that football stadiums are supposed to provide to the world, showing how the beautiful game can instantly become a fragile bunker when the absolute horror of reality breaches the stadium gates. While modern terrors are often broadcast in high definition, some of the scariest moments in the history of the sport belong to an era of historical isolation and atmospheric bizarre. On November 21, 1945, just months after the end of the Second World War, London was host to a highly anticipated friendly match that would quickly descend into a surreal and terrifying spectacle. The legendary Soviet team, Dynamo Moscow, was touring the United Kingdom, and they were scheduled to play against a heavily reinforced Arsenal side at White Hart Lane because Arsenal's home stadium, Highbury, was still being used as an air raid precaution center. On the morning of the match, a thick, heavy industrial London fog rolled across the city, completely blanketing the stadium in a dense, suffocating white cloud. Under modern regulations, the match would have been canceled or rescheduled within minutes. However, due to the immense diplomatic pressure surrounding the Soviet tour and the fact that over 50,000 desperate fans had packed into the stands, the referee made the highly controversial and dangerous decision to let the match proceed. From the moment the opening whistle blew, the football field transformed into a silent, ghostly void. The visibility was so poor that the players could literally not see a distance of 5 meters in front of their faces. The spectators in the stands could not see the grass, and the referee could not see the opposite side of the pitch, meaning the game was being played entirely in the dark. As the minutes ticked away, the atmosphere inside the stadium turned into a chaotic, unsettling psychological experiment. The Soviet players realized that they were completely invisible to the referee, and they began exploiting the fog in ways that bordered on the absurd. Witnesses later revealed that Dynamo Moscow actively made multiple illegal substitutions without the referee ever noticing, at one point playing with up to 15 men on the pitch at the exact same time. The match quickly became physically dangerous. Players were sprinting at full speed into the white void, completely blind to who or what was standing in front of them. The absolute terror of this atmospheric nightmare culminated in a series of shocking physical accidents. Arsenal's player George Drury was running at maximum velocity to chase a loose ball into the deep fog when he crashed violently headfirst into the solid wood of the goalpost, knocking himself completely unconscious on the spot. Because the fog was so dense, the medical staff could not locate his body on the field for several minutes, leaving him bleeding out in the white darkness while the game active play continued around him. In another bizarre incident, Arsenal's goalkeeper, positioning himself near his line, turned around and was startled to find a random spectator standing right next to him in a penalty box, a fan who had wandered onto the pitch after losing their way in the blinding fog. The players began shouting at each other in total confusion, unable to distinguish between teammate and opponent, reacting with pure survival instincts every time a human shape emerged from the white cloud. The referee was forced to rely entirely on the distant sound of kicking and shouting to guess where the ball was on the pitch. The game ended in a highly chaotic 3-4 victory for Dynamo Moscow, but the result mattered little to anyone involved. The sheer terror of the ghost match lay in the absolute loss of sensory control, a match where the basic rules of human perception collapsed, leaving 22 men to wander through a dangerous, blinding void where any sudden collision could result in a catastrophic, hidden injury away from the eyes of the world. The transition from physical danger on the pitch to the terrifying weight of psychological political terror reached its absolute peak during the 1974 FIFA World Cup in West Germany. This tournament marked the historic debut of Zaire, the very first sub-Saharan African nation to qualify for the biggest sporting event on the planet. The players were treated like national heroes before leaving Africa, showered with promises of luxury cars, houses, and financial wealth by their nation's brutal military dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu viewed the football team as a powerful tool for global propaganda, a way to showcase the strength, modernization, and prestige of his regime to the Western world. However, the moment the tournament began, the dream transformed into a dark, living nightmare of psychological dread. Zaire played their opening match against Scotland, performing with immense pride and athletic dignity despite suffering a respectable 2-0 defeat. But behind the scenes at their training camp, a massive logistical scandal erupted when the players discovered that the corrupt government officials had stolen their entire financial bonus pool, leaving them completely broke in a foreign land. Deeply demoralized and refusing to exert themselves fully, the players essentially went on strike during their second group match against Yugoslavia. The result was a catastrophic, humiliating 9-0 defeat that was broadcast live to millions of television viewers worldwide, causing immense public embarrassment to Mobutu back home. The dictator's reaction was immediate, ruthless, and terrifying. Before their final group match against the reigning world champions, Brazil, a group of Mobutu's elite personal security guards and military executioners arrived at the Zaire Team Hotel in West Germany. They gathered the terrified players into a private room and delivered a cold, explicit ultimatum straight from the presidency. The guards informed the squad that if they lost to Brazil by a margin of 4 goals or more, none of them would be allowed to return home alive, and their families, wives, and children would face immediate execution or forced labor camps in the African jungle. The players entered the pitch against Brazil on June 22nd, knowing that they were not playing for a trophy, a medal, or athletic glory. They were literally sprinting to keep their families alive. The psychological terror of that afternoon was captured in one of the most famous, bizarre, and widely misunderstood moments in World Cup history. Brazil was leading 3-0 in the 85th minute, meaning Zaire was hovering on the exact precipice of disaster. The referee awarded a free kick to Brazil just outside the penalty box, and as the legendary Roberto Rivellino stood over the ball waiting for the whistle, Zaire defender Ilunga Mwipu broke from a defensive wall, sprinted furiously toward the stationary ball, and blasted it far down the pitch before the kick could be taken. The global television commentators laughed openly at the incident, mocking Mwipu and labeling the moment as a classic example of naive African players who did not understand the basic rules of international football. The reality, however, was a chilling, heartbreaking display of raw human panic. Mwipu later revealed that he committed the deliberate foul in a desperate, frantic attempt to get himself sent off with a red card, hoping that a public expulsion would protect him or delay the match, because his mind was completely paralyzed by the terrifying thought that one more Brazilian goal would seal the death warrants of his entire family. The Zaire players fought with every single ounce of their remaining energy to maintain the 3-0 scoreline until the final whistle blew, successfully surviving the tournament and returning home to a life of poverty, isolation, and psychological scars. It remains one of the scariest and most oppressive chapters in the history of the World Cup, a stark historical testament to the terrifying darkness that occurs when the beautiful game is held hostage by the cold, bloody hands of a military dictatorship. The terrifying reality of psychological and physical pressure does not always come from state dictators or military regimes. In the modern era, the most immediate danger often walks through the front gates of a club's own training ground. On May 15, 2018, the elite training academy of Sporting Lisbon in Alcaquete became the setting for one of the most shocking, violent, and unprecedented acts of fan terrorism in the history of European football. Sporting Lisbon is one of the most prestigious clubs in Portugal, famous for developing global superstars like Cristiano Ronaldo, but the club was enduring a period of intense internal turmoil. They had just missed out on qualification for the lucrative UEFA Champions League after a disappointing loss to Maritimo on the final day of the league season, and a public, toxic war of words had erupted between the club's controversial president, Bruno de Carvalho, and the senior players. The tension reached an absolute breaking point on a quiet Tuesday afternoon as the first team squad was preparing for a training session inside their private locker room. Suddenly, a convoy of cars arrived outside the complex, and a highly organized mob of nearly 50 radical ultras associated with the notorious Juventude Leonida fan group breached the facility's security gates. The men were wearing black hoods, scarves, and masks to completely conceal their identities, and they were armed with heavy iron bars, leather belts, torches, and wooden clubs. They stormed through the academy corridors like a paramilitary unit, kicking down doors and trapping the players and coaching staff inside the dressing room. What followed was several minutes of pure, unadulterated terror. The Ultras unleashed a brutal, savage attack on their own players, screaming that the squad did not respect the shirt and deserved to bleed for their poor performances. They threw burning flares directly into the locker room, filling the enclosed concrete space with toxic, blinding smoke while they systematically beat the cornered athletes. Sporting star striker Bas Dost, who had scored dozens of goals for the club, was singled out and struck repeatedly in the head with a heavy belt buckle, leaving him lying on the floor with multiple deep, bleeding lacerations on his scalp. Other senior players, including international goalkeeper Rui Patricio and midfielder William Carvalho, were punched, kicked, and threatened with execution if they attempted to defend themselves or call for the police. The team's manager, Jorge Jesus, was struck in the face while trying to intervene and protect his young squad from the weapons. The sheer terror of the Al-Qaeda Academy attack lay in the absolute violation of a space that is supposed to be a professional athlete's ultimate sanctuary. The training ground is a private, secure workspace where players leave their families every day, assuming they are protected by elite security infrastructure. Seeing that sanctuary completely dismantled by an armed, angry mob of masked men transformed the psychological landscape of Portuguese football instantly. When the attackers finally fled the scene before the riot police arrived, the locker room resembled a violent war zone, with blood smeared across the floor, broken furniture, and players weeping in absolute psychological shock and physical trauma. The aftermath of the attack sent a massive shockwave of fear through every professional locker room across the globe. In the weeks that followed, several of sporting's most valuable international players exercised their legal rights to unilaterally terminate their multi-million-dollar contracts, citing workplace violence and a complete lack of basic physical safety. They refused to ever step foot inside the club's facilities again, prioritizing their lives over their sporting careers. It remains a deeply chilling historical artifact that proves how the extreme, unregulated fanaticism of modern football culture can easily cross the line into domestic terrorism, leaving elite athletes entirely defenseless against the very people who claim to support them. When discussing the raw, psychological weight of terror within a football match, it is impossible to ignore the moments where the sporting structure completely collapses on the world's biggest stage, forcing 22 elite athletes into a state of collective madness. On June 25, 2006, the Frankenstadion in Nuremberg became the setting for a World Cup round of 16 match between Portugal and the Netherlands that is universally remembered as the most undisciplined, chaotic, and psychologically terrifying battle in modern tournament history. The fixture was highly anticipated as a masterclass of technical football featuring legendary icons like Luis Figo, Deco, Arjen Robben, and a young Cristiano Ronaldo. However, from the very first minute, the tactical plans evaporated, replaced by an atmosphere of intense physical hostility and raw human anger that completely paralyzed the stadium. The referee assigned to maintain order was the Russian official Valentin Ivanov, but he quickly found himself trapped inside an escalating spiral of violence that he could not contain. The physical terror began after just 2 minutes of play, when Dutch midfielder Mark van Bommel executed a brutal, cynical challenge from behind. Just 5 minutes later, Khalid Boulahrouz committed a devastating, high boot tackle directly into the thigh of Cristiano Ronaldo. The impact was so severe that it left the young Portuguese winger weeping on the turf, his leg deeply bruised and lacerated, forcing him to be substituted off the pitch in tears after just 34 minutes. This early injury acted as a toxic catalyst, turning the match into a literal blood feud between the two nations. The players completely lost their professional composure, abandoning the ball to actively hunt down their opponents with late tackles, flying elbows, and aggressive headbutts. Ivanov attempted to regain control by aggressively issuing cautions, but his strict approach backfired spectacularly, creating a psychological siege mentality where the players felt completely unprotected by the authority on the pitch. Every single decision sparked a massive, chaotic multiplayer brawl, with athletes pushing, shoving, and screaming directly into the faces of the officiating crew. The absolute terror of the Battle of Nuremberg lay in this total breakdown of psychological restraint among world-class professionals. The game devolved into an anarchic theater of revenge, where the threat of a severe, career-ending injury lurked in every single split-second duel. Maniche was brutally taken down, Costinha committed a deliberate handball that resulted in his expulsion, and the Dutch icon Wesley Sneijder violently shoved a Portuguese player to the turf during a massive touchline riot. By the time the final whistle blew, sealing a chaotic 1-0 victory for Portugal, Ivanov had issued an unprecedented 16 yellow cards and a record-breaking 4 red cards, reducing both teams to 9 men on the pitch. The physical intensity was so exhausting that several players who had been sent off, including Barcelona teammates Deco and Giovanni van Bronckhorst, were captured by television cameras sitting together on the concrete steps of the stadium tunnel, casually chatting while shaking their heads at the absolute madness they had just left behind on the grass. The match remains a chilling, fascinating historical case study of how easily the thin veneer of professional sportsmanship can be completely ripped away under intense psychological pressure. It proved to a global audience of millions that even the most celebrated, elite stars of modern football can instantly revert to raw, tribal violence when a match transforms from a tactical game into an unregulated, dangerous war of attrition. While players bear the immense physical toll of on-pitch violence, there's an entire class of football participants who face a completely different, silent, and deeply terrifying form of danger: the referees. On March 8, 2005, the Stamford Bridge Stadium in London hosted a highly explosive UEFA Champions League round of 16 second-leg clash between Chelsea and Barcelona. This match became the final, tragic catalyst for one of the scariest and most shameful chapters in the history of football officiating, culminating in the sudden retirement of Europe's top referee, Anders Frisk. The Swedish official was widely regarded as a master of game management, known for his calm demeanor and strict adherence to the rules. However, the first leg encounter in Barcelona had already been turned into a toxic media circus by Chelsea's manager, Jose Mourinho, who publicly accused Frisk of inviting Barcelona coach Frank Rijkaard into his private dressing room during halftime to manipulate the match. This unverified accusation spread like wildfire across the global football landscape, instantly painting a massive target on Frisk's back. When he stepped onto the London pitch for the second leg, the atmosphere inside the arena was not one of sporting enthusiasm, but of pure, unadulterated hostility directed straight at the refereeing crew. Every single whistle Frisk blew was met with an absolute wall of deafening boos, screams, and aggressive physical gestures from the home crowd and the Chelsea technical bench. The match was a high-octane, chaotic affair that pushed the physical and mental limits of everyone involved, with players engaging in late challenges and constant psychological gamesmanship. Frisk managed to complete the 90 minutes under immense pressure, but the real terror did not stay within the stadium walls. In the days following the match, Mourinho's toxic rhetoric bore fruit in the darkest corners of the football fanbase. Anders Frisk's private phone number, personal email address, and home registration details were leaked online by radical fan groups. Within 48 hours, the Swedish referee was subjected to a relentless, terrifying campaign of targeted intimidation and domestic harassment. He received thousands of explicit death threats from angry supporters who blamed him for Chelsea's perceived mistreatment. The psychological horror reached a breaking point when radical fans began showing up directly outside his family home in Sweden, shouting insults through his gates and tracking the daily movements of his children on their way to school. Frisk received letters detailing exactly how he and his family would be executed if he ever stepped foot on an English pitch again. The sheer terror of this ordeal lay in the absolute erasure of the boundary between a professional sports job and personal family survival. Frisk realized that the institutional protection provided by UEFA and FIFA was completely useless against a decentralized mob of angry fanatics who knew where his children slept at night. On March 12, just 4 days after the London match, a deeply shaken Anders Frisk officially announced his immediate, permanent retirement from professional football at the age of 42, sacrificing his elite career to ensure the basic physical safety of his family. The news sent an unprecedented shockwave of fear through the global refereeing community. It proved that a referee could perform their duties to the absolute best of their ability, only to have their entire life dismantled and their family's safety compromised due to the reckless words of a manager and the tribal madness of modern ultras. It remains a chilling historical artifact that showcases the dark, dangerous vulnerability of the men in black, proving that the whistle can sometimes become a terrifying lightning rod for real-world violence. When we look back across the entire history of the beautiful game, we can clearly see that football is far more than just a simple sporting pastime. It is a profound, high-stakes reflection of human emotion, raw passion, and the unpredictable complexities of life itself. We have traveled from the terrifying, sudden biological collapses of Christian Eriksen and Fabrice Muamba to the violent physical collisions of Petr Cech and the chaotic, anarchic battlefields of Santiago and Nuremberg. We have witnessed how the safe sanctuary of a football pitch can be instantly breached by the cold reality of geopolitical terrorism, as seen during that terrifying night in Paris, or held completely hostage by the bloody hands of a military dictatorship in the case of Zaire in 1974. The deep exploration of these historical events reveals a deeply chilling truth about the sport we all love so passionately. Football operates on an incredibly thin, fragile border that separates absolute sporting glory from pure, unadulterated human terror. The very same intensity, tribal loyalty, and emotional obsession that make football the most popular spectacle on the planet are the exact same forces that can transform a stadium into a dangerous trap, a training ground into a war zone, and a referee's private family home into a target for domestic harassment. It is a fascinating and unsettling dichotomy that will always define the psychological landscape of elite sports and player safety. Before we wrap up this epic journey through the darkest and most terrifying archives of the sport, I absolutely need your final verdict. If you made it all the way to the end of this intense documentary, you are a true, dedicated football fanatic. Smash that subscribe button right now to join our growing community. Hit the like button to show your support for the channel, and leave a comment below giving me your absolute honest opinion. Which of these real-world historical moments do you think was the absolute scariest and most shocking to witness live? And how do you think modern clubs can better protect their players and referees from these extreme dangers? Let us start a massive, respectful debate down in the comments section, because we actively read every single one of them. What we can say for certain right now is that the beautiful game will always carry an element of inherent, unpredictable risk that cannot be fully regulated away by technology or security protocols. The modern pitch remains a grand theater where human excellence and human vulnerability coexist in their most raw, volatile forms. The elite athletes and officials who step onto that grass every single week make an immense psychological and physical sacrifice, operating at a level of intensity that keeps millions of us completely mesmerized. They prove that true courage does not lie in the absence of fear, but in the ability to face these terrifying realities, rebuild after catastrophic tragedies, and continue playing the game that unites the world. The archive of football history has closed this chapter on the scariest moments, reminding us to never take the safety, the health, and the peace of the sport for granted. Thank you so much for watching. Keep the debate alive down in the comments, and we will see you next time on the Football Archive.